We apologize for the delay of the conference. There were just some technical difficulties, but I think we're good to go now. Okay? So please take a few moments of silence as we start with a prayer.
O glorious apostle, Saint Jude Thaddeus, true relative of Jesus and Mary, I salute you through the most sacred heart of Jesus. I praise and thank God for all the graces He has bestowed upon you. I implore you through the sacred heart of Jesus to look down upon me with compassion. Despise not my poor prayers, and let not my trust be in vain. To you has been assigned the privilege of aiding us in the most desperate cases. Come to my aid that I may praise the mercy of God. All my life I will be grateful to you and will be your faithful client until I can thank you in heaven. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Welcome back, everyone. We are now on the second part of our two-day international conference, and I'd like to extend our deep appreciation to those who are with us again today, and of course to those who are just joining us in this event. So yesterday was a very enlightening session with our keynote speaker, Bishop Rex, our invited guests, Father Robert and Father Philip. But I'm sure today will be much more interesting as we dive a little bit more about understanding the Apostle St. Jude. But before we begin, let me introduce myself again. I'm architect Mariel Gamalinda, your moderator. Also, before we proceed with the talks, I will have to give you a walkthrough on how it's going to be for today's session. So for today, we have three speakers. They are allotted 30 minutes presentation, and immediately after, they are allowed to answer 1 to 2 questions. So maybe around 10 minutes for a quick open forum. This is to answer queries and reactions from their fellow speakers or from our audience on Facebook. So all questions will be entertained after the presentation. To our line of speakers, please turn off your microphones as a courtesy to the presenter. So I think we're all set. Let me introduce our first speaker. So she is a PhD candidate in the University of California in Los Angeles, Anthropology Department, subfield of Archaeology, with a focus in Spanish period Philippines. She is also on the student e-board for Los Angeles chapter of Archaeological Institute of America to give us a talk on tradition, change, and identity, the repurposing of religious icons. Let us all welcome and listen to Miss Madeline Yakal.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so first I would like to, of course, say thank you to everyone on the conference and panel, especially Father Francis, for inviting me to present some of the things that I work on, some of the topics I've been studying. And I also want to thank our presenters and Father Rex from yesterday. I was catching up on the videos earlier today. I wasn't able to participate live due to the time difference, but I'm really happy to be here with everyone to kind of share what I've been working on. So let me just, okay. So everyone can see my screen, right? Okay. So today I'll be talking about tradition, change, and identity, the repurposing of religious icons. Oh, you can't see my screen? Let me try. How about now? How about now? Okay. Patient. How about now? Okay, hold on. Okay. Okay. So sorry for the technical difficulties, but I am glad, as Al said before, to be here. Glad that everyone is able to tune in, and hopefully they are staying safe in the aftermath of the typhoon. But to kind of get into why I'm here and what I'll be talking about today in my brief presentation. So I'm an anthropological archaeologist. Mostly what I do, especially when I'm in Bicol, when I'm working there, usually in the summers, is to excavate. But today I'm not going to be talking about excavations. When I say I'm an archaeologist, what I really mean is I am interested in material culture and how we interact with the objects around us, how we interact with the landscape, how we interact with places and other people. And those behaviors that we do, they leave marks on the world through the stuff we leave behind, through the buildings we put up, through the marks in the ground. And that's often why most archaeologists do excavate, because in order to study the material culture, the artifacts of the past, we have to dig to get to those. But there's another layer to that. There's other approaches to studying material culture, and that's through an iconographic analysis. And so today, for the purpose of this conference, studying St. Jude and the research behind St. Jude, I want to approach this with an iconographic perspective and an iconographic lens. And so here we have, just to kind of emphasize my point, all of these images are recognizable as St. Jude, but they all look different. And oftentimes when we look at iconographies, there are different ways to recreate them. There are different ways to break them down and try and understand them. And so the first thing I want to do is to break down, what do I mean by iconography? And so iconography is the study of a representation or a symbol. And so icons can present themselves as art, as pictures, as busts, as statues, any kind of representation of something else. And so that's why we see like the iconography of St. Jude, even though it's recognizable by shared characteristics, such as the flame over his head, the medallion, the staff or the club. Even though those are repeated, all of these images look kind of different, but they're all representing the same icon. And we can think of icons in many different ways. So if you look at all of these images I'm throwing up on the screen now, each of these icons represents something different. And you might recognize all of them, or you might only recognize a couple of them. The way that we interpret different symbols and different icons is going to depend on our positionality, on who we are, where we are from, the background information that we have. Those are all going to change how we interpret them. So if you're watching, you might recognize about half of them or all of them. So some of them, for example, the black and white image at the top, that icon, that's the icon for Uber, but Uber hasn't been in the Philippines for a couple of years. I think it's been bought out by Grab, so you might not recognize that icon. You'll of course recognize the Philippine sun, but if you're a person who does not live in the Philippines and does not know many Filipinos, you might not recognize it. We also have the Bruin Bear from my school, UCLA, a Harry Potter icon, an engagement ring, a recycling arrow, Batman, McDonald's, of course. But think about, why do we know what these icons are? We know what the McDonald's icon is because the corporation has paid a lot of money to advertise and put this image out, so that it's instantly recognizable, and that when you see it, it elicits certain feelings in you. Their goal is to make you think, maybe I want to go out and purchase something from this company. It's elicited those emotions from you. But what about the image or the icon in the bottom left-hand corner? I'm looking at the eagle with the snake and the cactus. You might recognize what that is and you might not. And so that is the Mexican eagle, and that symbol with the snake, with the cactus, is meant to represent Mexico as a nation state. And if you're watching in the Philippines, you might not know that because that's not something you'd regularly interact with on the daily. But that symbol has a lot of meaning behind it, both historical and modern. Now, the second page of icons I have is the cross. So even within our own faith, within the Christian faith, the cross can mean a lot of things. The way that it's shaped, the way that it appears, how it's formatted, can really indicate what sect of Christianity you belong to. And all of these different representations of the cross, they're all different forms of iconography. They're all different forms of showing that phenomena of Jesus dying on the cross in different ways. And so even within Christianity, iconography varies a lot. And then if we think about, okay, so that's at Christianity at the broadest level, but what about Catholicism underneath that umbrella of Christianity? What kinds of variations in iconography exist within the Catholic faith? And that's where we have the devotion to saints. So devotion to saints is something that's unique to Catholicism that we don't see in Protestant religions. And something very recognizable about being Catholic. The fact that when you go to a Catholic parish, there's a parish saint, such as St. Jude, St. Paul, St. Peter. Each parish is named for a specific saint. And there's meaning behind that. There's meaning behind why certain saints are chosen for certain parishes. And what I want you to do now is think, what saints do you find important within your own life? And why is that? Is it based on maybe the saint of the parish you grew up in? Is there a saint that perhaps you grew up, your family was devoted to this saint, and so now you are too? Or is there perhaps a saint that you read about when you were younger or older that you felt affinity for, and then you decided to devote yourself to that saint? There's meaning behind these relationships, and those are the kinds of things I want to unpack by looking at the iconography, because the iconography is important. For example, for me, I get a lot of questions about why I'm interested in iconography, why I'm interested in Catholic iconography specifically. And the simple answer is, because I needed something to study. But when I really thought about my own history and looking at icons, my own history, my own personal history as a Catholic, it actually made me remember when I was younger, my mom would give me a crucifix to take with me on sleepovers when I was young. And that really stood out, that no other girls in elementary school were taking crucifixes this big in their sleeping bag, but me. And I thought it was something totally normal, but that was something uniquely Catholic. and uniquely Filipino, because all my friends were Catholic at my Catholic school, but I was the only one carrying a crucifix around when I was out of my home. And these icons are important for a lot of reasons that I'm going to talk about. But that's one thing what I want you to think about, to start thinking about these things archaeologically. How do we interact with these icons in real time, in our real experiences? And so my talk today, my interest in icons and Catholic icons specifically, is kind of born out of wanting to understand Spanish colonialism in the Philippines better. And if I'm going to study Spanish colonialism, then I need to be looking at Catholicism. Those two are related, inextricably related. When the Spanish came to the Philippines in the 1500s, first contact in 1521, they brought Catholicism with them. In 1565, when the Spanish established colonial administration in the Philippines, converting the locals, converting the indigenous people to Catholicism was one of their three main goals. They wanted to spread Spanish Catholicism specifically. And so one interesting thing about bringing Spanish Catholicism to the Philippines is that it didn't come directly from Spain. It came from Spain by way of Mexico, which was where New Spain, a colonial administration in the Americas, was established. And so Philippine Catholicism, and thus Philippine Catholic icons, are unique in the sense that they've followed this kind of track along the world, from Spain to Mexico or New Spain, and then to the Philippines. And so the icons that we find in the Philippines that, you know, individuals and communities have devoted themselves to, they've gone through many processes of transformation. Because even before Catholicism got to Spain, where did it originate? Catholicism has a long history even before it got to Spain. And so these icons such as Mary, St. Jude, Jesus, they've all transformed multiple times before they got to the Philippines at all. And then what my specific research looks at is I'm wanting to see, how did these devotions to saints develop? How did they develop over time? Why specific saints in specific parishes or in specific places? And the answer to this question is going to vary depending on what saint we're looking at. So if we're looking at Santo Niño in Cebu, the story of how Santo Niño got there, it's kind of contested. It's kind of contested whether it was brought by Spain or if the icon was already there. And you might think, why does this even matter? Why does it matter if Santo Niño was already in some form existing in Cebu before Magellan got there, before everyone got there? Why does it matter where it came from? And it does matter for these questions because colonialism, and unfortunately Catholicism by association, has kind of a dark history of how it got here and how it spread. And so a lot of scholars, people who are interested, and perhaps my own understanding of this is a bit viewed because I am in the diaspora, I am US based, and I was not born in the Philippines. But a lot of people, they really want to pinpoint when was the separation between colonial traditions and pre-colonial traditions. People are really interested in the moment that those converged. They're interested in how they transformed over time. They want to know basically how these things came to be. And so picking apart that iconography and that history of these icons is important. And that's one of those reasons. So the history of Santo Niño can be kind of complex. The history of St. Jude, it depends on what part of the world we're looking at where St. Jude came about. So yesterday, I think it was Father Robert mentioned in his presentation that St. Jude has such a following in Armenia, the patron saint of Armenia, one of the first saints that was brought over there. And if that devotion to St. Jude has persisted over time, that means that St. Jude has become quite a bit a part of or woven into Armenian history and Armenian culture. And that's an important thing to look at, because along with St. Jude comes all that iconography, that backstory, the meaning of what St. Jude stands for and what his iconography represents, the hopeless situations, impossible situations. How do Armenian people of the past interpret that? And how do Armenian people today continue to interpret that and continue to devote themselves to St. Jude? And so that's a different kind of story of how that devotion developed. And then for my specific research, what I devote most of my time to understanding is Our Lady of Peñafrancia, right in Naga, right in Bicol. And that, again, is another complex history of how the icon of Our Lady of Peñafrancia of Ina came about. If you're watching from Bicol, then of course you're familiar with the backstory of Ina, how Miguel de Covarrubias brought the icon of Our Lady of Peñafrancia into Bicol. And the whole story of how the locals had recently, the Cimarrones had recently converted to Catholicism, and they asked Miguel de Covarrubias, can we have an icon that we can devote ourselves to? And he gave them Our Lady of Peñafrancia. They built the first image of Our Lady of Peñafrancia, the first icon. They killed the dog. They used the blood to paint her face. They threw the dog into the river, and then instead of remaining dead, the dog came back to life, swam through the river, jumped out on shore, and ran home. And those little bits, that background of how that happened, those legends or history, however you want to call it, another part from earlier in the conference that I'll get back to, they all build up that story and that importance of Our Lady of Peñafrancia, specifically in Naga City. Our Lady of Peñafrancia, the patron saint of the Bicol region, she is important specifically because she's linked to that story. Imagine if that story didn't exist, if that story wasn't told every time Our Lady of Peñafrancia comes up in discussion, in dialogue every year. What parts of the devotion to her would no longer be there? For example, if there was no story about the dog in the river, then would we still have fluvial procession along the river every year? Would we still have that if there was no miracle with the dog, would people still feel affinity for that original icon? Would the locals have devoted themselves to her in the same way, with the same love and devotion, if there weren't those stories that kind of bonded them to her and to this icon? So those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. When we're looking at iconography, there's two things we can look at. One, what does the icon even look like? You know, if we're looking at Our Lady of Peñafrancia, she's usually her manto is that triangular shape. She has the jewels around her head. She is crowned. She is holding infant Jesus. Those are all meaningful. But there's another part we can also look at, and that's her background, the history, how she came to be important in this region, important in Bicolano life. And then how is she important today? How do we interact with that icon still today? So remember, it's not always just what does the icon look like, but about how we interact with it. And so that's what I'm hoping my contribution to this discussion, it's not just in what does St. Jude look like or appear, which is all important, but also how do we interact with St. Jude today? And why do we interact a certain way? Because the way that we interact with St. Jude is going to differ from how we interact with Santo Niño. And that's going to differ with how we interact with Our Lady of Peñafrancia. Each of our interactions individually and as a community are going to vary. And they all kind of speak to those lived experiences. They speak to what constitutes and what composes different icons. So a lot of other people have the same questions as me. They're interested in iconography, specifically Catholic iconography, because Catholicism, as I mentioned before, it's spread widely throughout the world. Spanish brought the Spanish brought Catholicism not just to the Philippines, but also, as I mentioned, to the Americas, both North America and South America and Central America. And so a lot of the things that I've been looking at to kind of draw inspiration and get direction where we can go when looking at Philippine iconography, a lot of it is based in what's been done by art historians and other archaeologists in Mexico, or what was then called during the colonial period, New Spain. So as I mentioned before these Catholic icons got to the Philippines, they didn't come directly from Spain. They came from Spain by way of New Mexico, because a lot of the friars, the priests that were present in the Philippines had been sent from New Spain. And there's a lot of important iconography, Catholic iconography, that we can look at in Mexico in the same way we can look at Philippine iconography, to try and understand what are the different parts of these icons. What are they composed of? What does that say about their history, about the people that are devoted to them, and about how they've come about from their initial creation, their initial drawing, to now. And so the first one I want to look at is the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so she is, I'm going to say, the most recognizable icon on this slide. There's only three, but she's the most recognizable, and her story is very recognizable too. And so the Virgin of Guadalupe is also known as the Mother of Mexicans, and she's a Marian icon. And just like Our Lady of Peñafrancia, Santo Niño, the story of how this icon in this particular picture that you recognize, the story of how this image came about, it's based on an appearance in 1531. So as the story goes, in 1531, on a hill in Mexico, she appeared to Juan Diego, who was a newly Christianized native. And she spoke to him in the Aztec language of Nahuatl. And so he essentially saw this image, shared what he saw with people, and they created a painting. And so this icon differs from Peñafrancia, because Peñafrancia is a physical, like a statue and icon. Santo Niño is a physical statue and icon. St. Jude is a seriation of images that is reproduced. But the original image for Guadalupe is a painting. And if you want to go see the painting in Mexico City, I think I was actually shocked the first time I saw it, because I'm so used to the Philippine icons and seeing Our Lady of Peñafrancia, which is a physical statue, a physical thing, and then to go in Mexico City when you go to the church and you see the painting. I don't think I expected a painting, and I actually almost missed it, because you're on a kind of like a flat escalator that's moving you to keep the crowd moving. I almost missed it. I didn't even know to look up and see that the painting was there. But there she was. And this painting has attracted so much attention. The story of her apparition drew so many people to that place. And so her iconography is rooted in many things. One, it's rooted in the landscape, that spot where she appeared. Two, another part of her iconography is the fact that she spoke an Aztec language. She didn't speak Spanish, which was the language of the colonizer. So that was another interesting part of her story. And then three, the way that she actually appears. So if you look at her imagery, if you look at her iconography, she's recognizable as Mary for some of the more basic Catholic conceptions of what Mary should look like. That she has her hands folded, she is veiled, she has a halo around her whole body, the color of her clothing. Those are all typical, generally Catholic components of her imagery. But there are some that make her specific to this place, specific to this iconography. And that is that her halo goes all the way around her body. She also has olive ashen skin, straight black hair, the sun and moon iconography below her, the Aztec eagle. I'm not sure if you can see it fully in this picture, but remember the eagle that I showed that is now part of the iconography of Mexico as a nation state. Those are all parts of this image of Virgin of Guadalupe found in Mexico. And so a lot of scholars argue, especially recently, that the way that people constructed this image of Mary, this iconography of Mary, was for a specific purpose. It was intended to incorporate both traditionally Catholic components with indigenous components. And that way it would make the iconography more recognizable, more familiar, and it would elicit emotions within the indigenous community that they had felt with their previous iconography before the Spanish got there. So that's an active choice of manipulating iconography with specific goals in mind. And so the iconography of Our Lady of Guadalupe is one of probably the best examples of that combination, that hybridity, that active choice of incorporating multiple elements of different cultures together in one icon for some specific purpose. And so that's one example of a complex iconography within the Catholic faith. And what's interesting about this is, to understand this iconography, we can't necessarily look to the Bible for support. We can't look in biblical texts. But what we can do is look at historical documents of what Spanish friars, what Spanish priests recorded during this time, to try and understand maybe who created the image, if they recorded any reason why. And we can also look at church records, because eventually, at some point, whenever these phenomena occur, the church does have to get involved and validate, that this icon is important, that this icon is a local phenomenon, that this icon is important to the Catholic faith. And so some of the other examples I have here about Catholicism in New Spain, turning away from the iconography of Mary and looking at, let's look at the one on the right first. This is a picture of a nun in New Spain in Mexico. And scholars have explored the similarities between Catholic nuns and Aztec Vestal Virgins. And so Mexican Creole scholars and priests wrote about the parallels between the Aztec past and the colonial present. He talked about Vestal Virgins in Aztec culture who were young girls who served the Aztec faith, and they were linked by the imagery of flowers. And so during the colonial period, he wrote about this Aztec practice of young girls being associated with flowery imagery. They were crowned with flowers and then taken to a temple to be dedicated to a sacred life of service and sometimes mortal sacrifice. And then sometime during the 18th century, Catholic nuns in paintings in New Spain were associated with flowers also. So prior to this period, when nuns were painted, they weren't really painted in association with flowers. But this scholar argues that in doing this, they were trying to elicit and evoke that same imagery of those Aztec Vestal Virgins. So again, actively choosing which aspects of a pre-colonial culture to integrate into now a new identity, new culture, new tradition, in order to perhaps elicit those same emotions or continue certain traditions or maintain certain aspects of identity. We don't see this flowery imagery in many other Spanish portraits of nuns back in Spain. Only in Mexico is where they're recorded. Likewise, if we look at Saint Joseph, and so I've been in the process of trying to scan this book to share with Father Francis. It's a book called Creating the Cult of Saint Joseph by Charlene Villaseñor-Black. She's another professor at UCLA, and she's spent a significant amount of time looking at the iconography of Saint Joseph, it's specifically in Mexico, in New Spain. And prior to the 1400s, 1500s, Saint Joseph is not really discussed all that much, and he doesn't appear much in art. It's not until we get to New Spain that we see his figure incorporated in a lot of paintings, increasing in popularity as the years go on, with specific purpose. So she argues that the Spanish in Mexico purposefully elaborated upon the cult of Saint Joseph because they wanted to create him as a figure that locals could essentially aspire to be. He was the perfect father figure. He took care of Jesus. He took care of Mary. They built him up through paintings, and she recorded over time that more and more paintings appeared with him gaining more prominence. And that was an active decision by the Spanish to try and make him into a figure that